political analyst Thapelo Tselapedi joins us in studio to discuss South African politics after his death. Thapelo, thank you so much for joining us. Now, when we speak of Nelson Mandela, nation building comes up, reconciliation comes up. But from your view, what would you say is Nelson Mandela's legacy?
Look, I think you have to start from the negotiations. I think part of the reason or rationale for the negotiations was to try and achieve justice and more so really just peace, because there was a lot of obviously violence happening in the KZN area and Gauteng area and some parts obviously of the Eastern Cape and the Northwest in particular. So I think his legacy was trying to establish peace. Obviously there was his mantra was also around reconciliation, and you saw that in sports and how it manifested with him going to those sporting events, and also with him trying to also accept, in a sense, the rule of law and the supremacy of the Constitution. So I think that's by and large his legacy, to try and say that these are the sort of institutions that I think a constitutional democracy should be able to embrace. I think that's part of Nelson Mandela's legacy moving forward.
Now, there have been some criticism coming from the EFF and other parties. I mean, Malema saying that Mandela sold out the Freedom Charter and the revolution. When we look at the complexities of, it's called a bloody miracle, and there were a lot of concessions that had to be made. But when you look at the concessions that they did make, do you believe that they made the best concessions?
Look, I think it's important to understand that the concessions, in those concessions, there were trade-offs made. And part of those trade-offs was to make sure that the stability in the country once peace was achieved. Obviously, by peace here, I'm talking the instance of making sure that the constitutional democracy is intact, making sure that Chapter 9 institutions are intact and are built. So that was then. But I think part of the trade-offs that were made, and I think a lot of people have written about them, was that economic transformation was not furthered. But one would obviously say, and others have said, that obviously this was a tactical retreat on the part of the ANC to rather focus on stability, and then later on start focusing on issues of land, on property, and perhaps looking clearly at how do you then administer Section 26 of the Constitution when it talks about distribution of property. So I think it's an unfinished project, and I think people must be able to understand our constitutional democracy as that, a revolution that has not yet passed. I think in many instances, South Africa has still yet to pass the nationalist syndrome or nationalism that other parts of the continent have done.
Now, I mean, you speak of a revolution that has not yet passed, but one of the issues that come up, especially when you look at the Freedom Charter, I mean, the people shall have a share in the country's wealth, and we look at economically. Would you say that Malema and them are right by saying that he traded off political power at the expense of economic liberation?
Yes and no, you can certainly say that, but I think it's important to understand that the EFF has the convenience of time to be making such arguments. In this period, we had the 2008 credit crisis, not just in this country, but globally. And I think that the country is in a much more unstable period than as before. So certainly in times like this, where there's rampant inequality, you are going to find such remarks where people are saying that actually the trade-off of economic transformation shouldn't have been a good result. But certainly it was able to cushion us those negotiations for a few years post the credit crisis. So I think there's a lot to say, and I think a lot of what the EFF is saying may be valid, but they do also have the convenience of time, which in a way bites into the argument.
Now, we have to look at, it's unavoidable. You look at the achievements made by that concession. We look at the infrastructure that his leadership enabled to be ushered in, a good foundation to start off. But when we look at post those concessions and post his government term, has his legacy been taken forward to the best of its abilities?
Look, I think it's important to start here. No individual in any historical epoch should be able to determine forever the developmental path of a country. I think it's validly, whether we see through the student protests or with the more left-leaning groups or formations in the country, people are able to say that actually, even though Nelson Mandela may have been saying this and the reconciliation was a mantra of his vision for South Africa post-1994. People may be able to still define their own developmental path or destiny for the country legitimately, as long as it's within, obviously, the confines of the constitutional architect that I think the African National Congress had mapped out. I mean, I think it would also be valid that people are saying, actually, that this has not worked out for now, and that if there's something within the constitutional, in the constitution that they can widen the democracy or look for redress or much more radical redresses, then let it be so. But to say that are we honoring I guess the rainbow nation that Nelson Mandela had founded, in a sense, would be ingenuous in a sense, because people over time have the ability to determine their own path.
Speaking of own paths, and I'm glad you mentioned the student protest, because as young people, we're sitting here, there are freedoms that were afforded to us as a result of the work of Nelson Mandela and the many, many millions of South Africans who were part of the struggle. But we have challenges, and we can't avoid those challenges. Yeah. They're confronting us daily. So how do we move forward with that legacy? How do we take what he's left for us and build something that future generations can be proud of?
Look, I mean, let me perhaps start that, what you're saying from the perspective of the Freedom Charter. Freedom Charter says, the land shall belong to everybody, there shall be trade in the country and so on and so forth. But all of these things need, one, legislative ability, two, and financial ability to finance them. So if we are going to talk about land redistribution, we have to say that, are there people in place to take over these things? Is there implementation of these projects? And can we finance these projects 3 to 5 years down the line so that there's some level of stability on these projects? So, like I said, I think right now we're in a bit of a shaky period economically and globally, not just South Africa itself. So how do we then attain those sort of stuff that not only Nelson Mandela had said, but also the Freedom Charter had declared? And I think it has to be just balanced against those state resources if possible, and right now we quite see that they're dwindling, whether you look at the different parastatals from SAA, and the different Transnet I think is doing better than, but if you look at also ESCOM, there's definitely problems there. So, but there has to be resources, in particular for these issues of obviously on universities. How do we get no fee increment? I mean, there must be resources for that. And how then do we get free education? And certainly there must be resources for that. And I think there's scope for NSFAS to then increase. So I think there's a political discussion to be had, but also there's a technical discussion over resources and legislation and what then the Constitution permits.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was our political analyst, Thapelo Tselapedi, speaking about the legacy of Nelson Mandela.